The sun beat down on the town of Redemption, baking the dust into a fine red powder that clung to everything, the air thick with the scent of sagebrush and hot iron from the blacksmith's forge shimmered in waves above the parched earth. Royce Bannon felt the sweat trickle down his spine, a foreign sensation, for a man more accustomed to the high plains' biting winds than the stifling heat of a town. He shifted his weight to the worn leather of his gun belt, creaking in the oppressive quiet of the Redemption Savings and Loan. The place felt like a church, all polished wood and hushed tones, and Royce felt as out of place as a wolf in a sheep pen. He was a rancher, a man whose conversations were with the sky and the cattle, whose hands were calloused from mending fences and guiding a plow. Towns were a necessary evil, a place to buy salt and sell hides. But this visit was different. This visit was for the future. Mr. Bannon, the clerk, a young man with a thin mustache and an air of self-importance, pushed a stack of crisp bills under the teller's grate. $1,000? A considerable sum. Royce met the clerk's curious gaze without expression. He gathered the bills, his large, rough hands moving with a slow deliberation that seemed to absorb the clerk's nervous energy. $1,000. It was more than just a bride price. It was the cost of a new beginning, the foundation for a life he hoped to build from the ashes of the old one. He folded the money and tucked it deep into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of the silver locket that rested there. He drew it out, the engraved filigree worn smooth from years of touch. Opening the clasp, he looked at the miniature portrait inside. Sarah. Her smile was a ghost, a memory so sharp it could still draw blood. Cholera had taken her and their infant son 3 years ago, a swift, merciless plague that had scoured his world clean of warmth and color. He had been left with nothing but silence and the endless, aching expanse of the prairie. This marriage, arranged through letters with a man he'd never met, was a dam against that silence. A practical arrangement, Magnus Carmichael had called it. His daughter Rosalie was strong and capable. Royce needed a wife. It was a simple transaction. A sudden commotion from the street shattered the bank's placid atmosphere. Shouts, the thunder of hooves, then the splintering crack of the bank's front door being kicked open. 3 men stormed in their faces, obscured by grimy bandanas. The leader, a tall, wiry figure with eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky, moved with a chilling economy of motion. He didn't shout or bluster. He simply raised his Colt peacemaker, and the world fell silent. On the floor, he set his voice a low rasp, devoid of emotion. Now. The clerk and the 2 other patrons dropped as if their strings had been cut. Royce, however, remained standing. He wasn't a hero, but he was not a man who moved at another's command without reason. His hand rested near the butt of his own revolver, his mind a cold, clear lake of calculation. 3 men. 2 focused on the safe one on the room. Winnable but messy. Innocent people would get hurt. The leader's gray eyes locked onto him. I sat on the floor. Royce slowly lowered himself to one knee, his eyes never leaving the outlaws. He could see the man's intelligence, the predatory stillness that marked him as something far more dangerous than a common thief. "You've got nerve, rancher," the outlaw said, a flicker of something not respect but cold assessment in his eyes. He gestured with his pistol toward Royce's coat. "The money. Hand it over." Royce's jaw tightened. He reached into his coat, his fingers closing around the thick wad of bills. He pulled it out, but as he did, the silver locket caught on the fabric and tumbled out, spinning across the polished floorboards. It came to rest near the outlaw's boot. The man's eyes flickered down to the gleaming object. He bent, scooping it up with his free hand. He didn't open it. He simply ran a thumb over the worn engraving, a strange, unreadable expression crossing his face. "Pretty," he murmured. He looked back at Royce, a slow, cruel smile touching his lips. "I'll take this too. A little something for my trouble." Something inside Royce, a cold, dormant rage, began to stir. "The money is yours," he said, his voice a low growl. "Give me back the locket." The outlaw's smile widened. He tucked the money into his saddlebag and dropped the locket into his own shirt pocket. "I don't think so." That was it. The line. The money was wood and nails for his new life. The locket was the tombstone of his old one. It was all he had left of her. Royce moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was pure, honed instinct. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and fired not at the leader, but at the chandelier hanging precariously above the other two outlaws who were stuffing bags with cash. The shot was perfect. The chain snapped, and the heavy iron fixture crashed down, sending a shower of glass and metal onto the two men, pinning them with a deafening clang. The leader spun, firing a shot that splintered the floor where Royce's head had been a second before. Royce was already rolling, coming up behind a heavy oak desk. Gunfire erupted. Glass shattered. The clerk screamed. Royce fired twice more, his shots precise, aimed not to kill, but to disable. One outlaw cried out, clutching a shattered kneecap. The other dropped his weapon, his hand a bloody mess. But the leader, Silas the Ghost Kane, as Royce would later learn he was called, was different. He didn't panic. He used the chaos, firing a single calculated shot into the ceiling plaster. As dust and debris rained down, creating a momentary screen, he backed out of the door and was gone. The sheriff and his deputies burst in moments later to find a scene of controlled carnage. Two wounded outlaws groaning on the floor, a terrified clerk, and Royce Bannon standing beside the desk, his pistol still smoking. His bride price was gone. But that wasn't the wound that bled. The empty space in his pocket where the locket used to be felt like a hole torn straight through his soul. He had tried to build a new life, and a ghost from the wilderness had stolen the last piece of his past. The journey to the Carmichael Ranch took 3 days each mile, carrying Royce further from the raw violence of redemption and deeper into a vast, unforgiving landscape. A lone hawk circled in a sky the color of bleached bone, its cry the only sound breaking the oppressive silence of the plains. This was Royce's world, a place of stark beauty and brutal truths, and he understood its language. It was the world of men he found increasingly foreign. He had sent a detailed letter to Sheriff Miller in Redemption, describing the outlaw leader, the cold gray eyes, the lean build, and most importantly, the unique filigree on the stolen silver locket. It was a faint hope, but it was all he had. The Carmichael Ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, a green slash of life against the endless brown of the surrounding hills. It looked prosperous from a distance, with a sturdy main house and well-maintained corrals. But as Royce drew closer, he saw the signs of decay: fences in need of mending, a barn roof, missing shingles, fields that lay fallow when they should have been planted. It was a place clinging to the memory of better days. Magnus Carmichael met him on the porch, a large man whose frame seemed to have been whittled down by worry. His handshake was limp, his smile overly eager. "Mr. Bannon, a pleasure, a true pleasure. We've been expecting you." His speech was rambling, punctuated by nervous glances over his shoulder, as if he expected a creditor to rise from the dust at any moment. He was ushered inside into a parlor that was clean but threadbare. And there he met the Carmichael daughters. Rosalie was the first to greet him, stepping forward with the confidence of a queen. She was as striking as her father's letters had promised, with fiery auburn hair and emerald eyes that missed nothing. She assessed Royce in a single sweeping glance, a flicker of approval in her expression. "Mr. Bannon," she said, her voice sharp and cultured, "I trust your journey was not too arduous." "It was long," Royce replied simply. Then from the shadows near the fireplace, another figure emerged. She was like a watercolor painting next to her sister's vibrant oil. Softer, quieter, with gentle brown hair and eyes that held a deep, sorrowful kindness. She clutched a book to her chest like a shield. "And this," Magnus said almost as an afterthought, "is my younger daughter Violet." Violet offered a small, hesitant curtsy, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Welcome to our home, sir." Her voice was a murmur, easily lost in the cavernous room. Royce felt a strange, unsettling pang of something. Pity, recognition. He wasn't sure. Rosalie dominated the room, her laughter bright and her opinions absolute, while Violet seemed to shrink with every word her sister spoke, trying to make herself invisible. The contrast was stark, and an unease settled in Royce's gut. Over the next few days, he saw it again and again. Rosalie planning the wedding details with brisk efficiency, her tone condescending whenever she addressed her sister. Magnus praising Rosalie's capabilities, while pointedly ignoring Violet's quiet competence in the kitchen and garden. They were a family teetering on a precipice, and Royce was their lifeline. He felt it in Magnus's desperate pleasantries, in Rosalie's possessive gaze. He was not a suitor. He was a solution. One evening, he saw Magnus in a hushed, frantic conversation with a ranch hand near the barn. The older man's face was pale with fear as he pressed a small coin into the hand's palm before sending him riding off into the twilight. It was the action of a man in deep trouble, a man sending a message he didn't want overheard. Royce filed the image away, another piece of a puzzle he didn't yet understand. The unease grew a low hum beneath the surface of the polite conversations and wedding preparations. Something was wrong here. Terribly wrong. The wedding day dawned clear and cool. The small wooden chapel miles from the ranch was sparsely filled with a few neighboring families and the town's itinerant preacher. The air was thick with the scent of pine wood and beeswax. Royce stood at the altar, his borrowed suit feeling stiff and unnatural. He was a man of action, of purpose, and this ceremony felt like a play in which he had been given no lines. The chaos of the morning had been a blur. Magnus flustered and sweating. Rosalie issuing orders like a general. And Violet, a silent shadow, moving through the house, ensuring everything was in its place. Now Magnus walked down the aisle, a veiled figure on his arm. Royce's gaze was fixed ahead, his mind on the ranch, on the future, on the quiet promise of a life rebuilt. He didn't truly look at the bride until she was standing beside him. Through the fine mesh of the veil, he could see she was trembling. Her hands clutching a simple bouquet of wildflowers were shaking so violently, he could hear the stems rustling. The preacher cleared his throat, sensing the palpable tension that had descended upon the room. Dearly beloved. Royce glanced at the Carmichaels. Magnus's face was as white as fresh snow, his mouth hanging open as if he'd seen his own grave. Rosalie, standing at the altar steps as the maid of honor, wore an expression of pure, unadulterated horror, her emerald eyes burning with a rage that seemed to poison the air. And the bride beside him, his bride, kept whispering a single phrase so quietly only he could hear. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to happen. Do you, Royce Bannon, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? The silence stretched taut and fragile. Every eye was on him, waiting. Royce looked down at the woman beside him. He saw the terror in the veiled shape of her face, and something else, a heartbreaking resignation. She looked like someone who had spent her entire life apologizing for her own existence. For a fleeting moment, he thought of the locket of Sarah, of the life he had lost. This was supposed to be the opposite of that grief. It was supposed to be a new start. "I do," he heard himself say. The words sounded like they belonged to someone else. A sound part, gasp, part strangled cry escaped Rosalie's lips. Magnus stumbled back a step, his hand flying to his chest. And the woman beside him, his wife, began to weep silent tears that spoke of a sorrow so deep it seemed to have no bottom. Something had gone horribly, irreversibly wrong. The preacher, desperate to conclude the ordeal, rushed through the final vows. "You may kiss the bride," he mumbled. Royce turned and lifted the veil. He found himself looking into the soft, tear-filled eyes of Violet Carmichael. She was stunning in a way that took his breath away, a fragile beauty like morning dew on wildflowers. But she was not Rosalie. He leaned in and gently, chastely kissed her forehead. It was a gesture of reassurance, not passion, and it seemed to surprise her. A flicker of gratitude warmed her terrified eyes. "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Royce Bannon," the preacher announced with forced cheer. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Rosalie's voice like ice cut through it. "Well, isn't this just perfect?" "There's been a mistake," Magnus Carmichael stammered, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool morning air. "A terrible misunderstanding." Rosalie let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "A mistake, Papa. He just married Violet. Sweet, innocent, worthless Violet." Royce felt his new wife flinch at the cruel words, her small frame seeming to shrink into itself. An instinct, fierce and protective, surged in his chest. He placed a steadying hand on her arm. The simple gesture seemed to infuriate Rosalie further. "We'll get an annulment," Magnus declared, his voice gaining a desperate strength. "We'll speak to the preacher, explain the confusion. With the veils, the rushing around. These things happen. No harm done." No harm done. Royce looked at Violet, at the tracks of tears on her pale cheeks, at the way she was already accepting her fate as a mistake to be erased. She had been harmed her entire life. He could see it in the architecture of her sadness. "And you," Rosalie turned her blazing eyes on him. "You will marry me. The sister you came for. The right sister." Royce's jaw clenched. He had been played for a fool, his desire for a new life, twisted into a desperate family's cruel charade. He had been lied to, manipulated, and used as a pawn in a game whose rules he didn't understand. His anger was a cold, hard knot in his stomach. But as he looked down at Violet, at the woman who was now legally his wife, he saw not a mistake, but a victim. He saw the same profound loneliness he had carried for 3 long years. "No." The single word fell into the chapel's tense silence like a stone into a still pond. "What did you say?" Magnus whispered. "I said no." Royce repeated, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "There will be no annulment." Rosalie stared at him, incredulous. "Don't be ridiculous. You can't possibly want to stay married to her. Look at her. She's a frightened, useless child." "That's my wife you're talking about." Royce said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I'd suggest you show her some respect." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Magnus's face flushed a deep, mottled red. Even Violet looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with a fragile, disbelieving hope. "Now see here, young man," Magnus blustered. "The arrangement was for Rosalie. The bride price, the contracts, it was all for her. You cannot simply decide to keep the wrong daughter." "Wrong daughter," Royce repeated the phrase slowly. "Is that how you see her, as the wrong one?" He looked from Magnus's sweating face to Rosalie's furious one. "From where I'm standing, she's the only honest person in this family. She didn't lie to me. She didn't try to deceive me. And she's not demanding I treat another human being like damaged goods to be returned." "How dare you," Rosalie spat. You have no idea what we've been through. I have worked my entire life to be everything a frontier wife should be. I will not be cast aside for that. That mouse. Rosalie, please stop, Violet whispered, her voice stronger than Royce had yet heard it. You're making it worse. Worse. Rosalie whirled on her sister. How could it be worse? You've ruined everything. I'm the one who can run a household, manage finances, bear strong sons. What can you offer him? Maybe, Violet said quietly, looking not at her sister but at Royce. I can offer him kindness. The simple, powerful truth of it silenced the room. In that moment, Royce made a decision. He had come seeking a capable partner, a strong woman, to help him build a future. He had been offered a contract. But looking at Violet, he saw the chance for something more, something real. Mr. Carmichael, Royce said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The preacher pronounced us man and wife. The law recognizes it, and I recognize it. Violet is my wife. The matter is settled. He offered his arm to Violet. It's time for you to be seen. She stared at his offered arm as if it were a mirage. Then, with a tentative grace, she placed her small hand on his forearm. You'll regret this. Rosalie's voice was a venomous hiss as they walked toward the door. There are things about her you don't know. Things that will change your mind. Royce felt Violet tense, a wave of shame and terror washing over her. Tell him, Violet, Rosalie taunted, her smile a cruel slash. Tell your new husband why no decent man in 3 counties would ever court you. Tell him about the baby. The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Royce stopped, looking down at his wife. Her face had gone completely white, her eyes begging him not to ask. What baby? Royce asked softly. Rosalie answered for her, savoring each word. The baby she had 2 years ago. Out of wedlock. The one that died 3 days after it was born, taking her reputation right along with it. The ugly secret was out, laid bare in the holy confines of the chapel. Everyone was watching him, waiting for the disgust or the rejection. Violet looked at him, her expression shattered, preparing for the final killing blow of his abandonment. But what she saw in Royce's eyes was not anger or disgust. It was compassion. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. I'm sorry, he said, his voice for her alone. I'm sorry you lost your child. And I'm sorry you've had to carry that grief alone. Violet stared, speechless. She had been armed for a battle, and he had offered her peace. The wagon ride to Royce's ranch was a long, silent journey across a sea of swaying prairie grass. They were strangers bound together by a ceremony of lies, each lost in their own private wilderness of thought. The silence was not hostile, but it was heavy, weighted with unspoken questions and the ghosts of their respective pasts. Royce's ranch was modest, a sturdy log house and a solid barn he had built with his own 2 hands. It was a lonely place, but it was honest and it was his. Life settled into a quiet, awkward rhythm. They moved around each other with the careful courtesy of wounded animals. Royce saw how Violet flinched at loud noises, how she kept her eyes downcast as if expecting a blow. He saw the scars left by a lifetime of being told she was worthless. So he spoke to her with a quiet respect she had never known. He asked for her opinion on where to plant the spring garden. He thanked her for every meal. He left a small bundle of wildflowers on the kitchen table one morning, a silent acknowledgement of her presence. Violet, in turn, began to emerge from her shell. She was a tireless worker, her hands skilled and gentle. The house slowly transformed under her care, filled with the scent of baking bread and the warmth of a well-tended hearth. She learned the rhythms of his moods, knowing when to offer a cup of coffee and when to grant him the solace of his own thoughts. A fragile trust began to grow between them. cultivated in the small, quiet moments. One evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the windows and shaking the very foundations of the house, Violet was staring into the fire, her face a mask of old pain. "He promised he loved me." She said, her voice so soft, Royce had to lean in to hear it over the howling wind. Thomas. He was the banker's son. He was handsome and charming, and he made me feel seen. Royce sat down in the chair opposite her, giving her the space to let the story unfold at its own pace. When I told him about the baby, everything changed, and she continued, her gaze locked on the dancing flames. His father forbade the marriage. He called me an opportunist. He threatened to ruin my father, to call in all his loans. So Papa made a deal. He took their money in exchange for our silence. She finally looked at Royce, her eyes swimming with a shame so profound it made his own chest ache. The baby. She was so small. She had a fever. The doctor said there was nothing to be done. I held her for 3 days, and then she was gone. Papa buried her in an unmarked grave at the edge of our property. He said it was best to forget. But I never have. Royce didn't offer empty platitudes or easy comfort. He simply sat with her in the charged silence, bearing witness to her grief. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. It was small and cold in his own. "My wife Sarah and our son, they died of cholera," he said quietly. "I buried them myself on the hill behind this house. I know what it is to be left with nothing but the remembering." In that moment, they were no longer a rancher and the wrong bride. They were two souls who understood the language of loss. Her fingers tightened around his, and for the first time she wasn't a frightened girl. She was his wife. A week later, a rider brought the mail from Redemption. Among the advertisements and a letter from his cattle buyer was an envelope from Sheriff Miller. Royce opened it, his heart quickening. "Mr. Bannon. We apprehended the 2 wounded men from the bank robbery. Under questioning, they gave up their leader's name, Silas Kane, also known as the Ghost, for his ability to disappear after a job. They claim he's working a personal vendetta, not just a robbery. A deputy on patrol near the Carmichael Ranch last week reported seeing a man matching Kane's description in the area. The deputy noted something unusual. The man was wearing a silver locket on a chain around his neck, one that matches the unique design you described. Be careful, Bannon. This feels like more than just money." Royce read the letter twice. Silas Kane, a personal vendetta, a locket identical to his own. The blood in his veins ran cold. The robbery hadn't been random. Kane hadn't just stumbled upon the locket, he had come for it. And he had been seen near the Carmichael Ranch. The unease he'd felt there, Magnus's fear, the secret conversations, it all began to coalesce into a terrifying, incomprehensible shape. This was not over. It had barely begun. The ride back to the Carmichael Ranch was a blur of dust and grim determination. Royce pushed his horse hard, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. "A personal vendetta. A locket identical to yours." The pieces were scattered, but they all pointed to this place, to the desperate man who had sold his daughter to save his own skin. He found Magnus in the barn, attempting to mend a piece of tack with trembling hands. The man looked older, more stooped than he had just a few weeks ago. "Bannon," he said, startled, "what are you doing here? Is she all right?" "She's fine," Royce said, his voice flat. He walked toward Magnus, his presence filling the dusty space, his shadow falling over the smaller man. "We need to talk. About a man named Silas Kane." The color drained from Magnus's face. He dropped the harness, his hands shaking uncontrollably. I don't know anyone by that name. Don't lie to me. Royce's voice was dangerously quiet. He robbed the bank in redemption the day I drew my bride price. He stole the money, and he stole something else from me. A silver locket. The sheriff tells me a man matching his description wearing an identical locket was seen near this ranch. Magnus sank onto a nearby hay bale, his face in his hands. "Oh, sweet mercy," he whispered. He came back. He was here before Royce stated the realization, hitting him like a physical blow. "You knew him. You were the one having hushed conversations in the dark, weren't you?" Magnus looked up, his eyes filled with the terror of a trapped animal. "I'm a ruined man, Bannon. Ruined. I borrowed money more than I should have, trying to keep this place afloat. The lender was unforgiving. He took everything I had, and when that wasn't enough, he said I still owed him a debt of service. And that lender was Silas Kane." Magnus nodded, his body racked with pathetic sobs. "He heard you were coming. He knew you were a man of means, haunted by your past. He said it was the perfect opportunity to settle an old score." Royce's mind raced, trying to connect the disparate threads. What score? I've never met the man. "You have, Magnus," whispered his voice, barely audible. "Or at least you knew his family. His name isn't Kane. That's a name he took. His real name is Silas Kale. His sister was Sarah." The world tilted on its axis. Sarah, her maiden name, had been Kale. She had a brother, Silas, a wild, angry young man who had vehemently opposed their marriage, who had vanished after a bitter argument, swearing Royce would regret taking his sister away to the unforgiving West. "He blames you," Magnus choked out, "for her death. He says if you hadn't dragged her out to this godforsaken land, she never would have caught the cholera. He's been nursing that hatred for 3 years, letting it fester. The robbery. The locket, it must have been a matched pair, a gift from their parents. The bride price. It was all coming into focus, a picture of cold, calculated revenge. The marriage, Royce said, his voice a dead whisper. The switch. It wasn't an accident. No, Magnus confessed, shame bowing his head. It was his idea. He said marrying you to Rosalie would be too simple. He wanted to hurt you, to mock your attempt to build a new life. He wanted you wed to the damaged daughter, to the wrong bride. It was an act of exquisite cruelty designed to give you a wife who would be a constant reminder of failure and shame. He forced me. He said if I didn't arrange it, he'd burn this ranch to the ground with my family inside. The sheer venomous spite of it stole Royce's breath. He had been so focused on the Carmichael's deception that he had never seen the puppet master pulling the strings. This wasn't about money or honor. It was about a brother's twisted grief, a revenge so personal and so cruel, it defied comprehension. Royce left Magnus Carmichael weeping in his barn, a broken man drowning in the consequences of his own cowardice. The ride back toward redemption was a race against a nameless dread. Silas Kane wasn't a common outlaw. He was a phantom driven by a singular, hateful purpose. And Royce had led him right to Violet. He found him in town. Redemption was quiet, the midday heat having driven most sensible folk indoors. Silas was leaning against the general store's veranda, cleaning his nails with the tip of a Bowie knife. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. He looked up as Royce dismounted, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He was wearing the locket openly now, a silver teardrop against his dark shirt. Bannon, Silas, said, his voice a soft rasp. I was wondering when you'd figure it out. Cale, Royce corrected him, stopping 20 feet away, the space between them humming with lethal tension. Your fight is with me. My fight is with the man who killed my sister Silas. said, his gray eyes turning hard as granite. You brought her to this wasteland, and you watched her die. You think a new wife and a new life just washes that away. She made her choice. Royce set his own voice tight with a grief he had never allowed himself to fully express. She wanted this life. With me. Did she? Silas took a step forward. Or did you fill her head with pretty lies about open skies and freedom, and she was fragile a flower? She belonged back home. He gestured around at the dusty street. Not here. This place kills everything beautiful. A few townsfolk had begun to peer from windows, sensing the imminent violence. Let's finish this, Royce said, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. Here and now. Leave Violet out of it. Silas laughed, a cold, empty sound. Oh, I could never do that. She's the punchline to the joke. The broken little bird I gave you to replace the one you let die. Does she cry at night, Bannon? Does she remind you of everything you've lost? His words were calculated daggers aimed at the deepest wounds Royce carried. No, this doesn't end here. It ends at your home, with her watching. Silas's men, 4 of them, materialized from the alleyways and doorways, their guns drawn. Royce was surrounded. A standoff in the middle of town would be a bloodbath. He saw the face of a child peering from the bakery window, wide-eyed with fear. He couldn't do it. With a snarl of frustration, Royce backed away slowly, his hand raised in a gesture of temporary surrender. Silas's smile was triumphant. Go on home, Bannon. I'll be along shortly. We have a family reunion to attend. Royce swung onto his horse and galloped out of town, the mocking laughter of Silas Cale chasing him. He was no longer just a man trying to protect his wife. He was a man racing to stop a ghost from destroying the last bit of light in his world. The sky was turning a bruised, sickly yellow as Royce neared his ranch. The wind had picked up a low, mournful howl that whipped dust and sagebrush across the plains. A sandstorm was coming. He spurred his horse onward, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was too late. Through the thickening haze, he could see them. 2 horses tied to his porch rail. He burst through the door to find his home transformed into a tableau of terror. Violet stood near the hearth, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Silas Kane sat in Royce's own chair, his boots propped up on the table, casually holding a pistol aimed at Violet's heart. Welcome home, brother-in-law, Silas purred. Your wife and I were just getting acquainted. Let her go, Silas, Royce said, his voice dangerously calm, as he slowly entered the room, his hands held away from his gun. This is between us. It always has been. Silas set his gaze flicking to the mantelpiece, where a small framed tintype of Sarah stood. I told her, you know. I told her you were a curse, that this land would swallow her whole. But she was blinded by your quiet promises. He stood up, stalking around the room, the pistol never wavering from Violet. My revenge wasn't just about killing you. That would be too quick. I wanted you to live with what you'd done. I wanted you to have a new wife, a broken one, and see my Sarah's face in her suffering every single day. The storm hit then, a furious wall of sand and wind that slammed against the house. The world outside disappeared into a roaring brown chaos. The light in the room dimmed, and the howling wind muffled every sound. As if summoned by the storm's fury, the front door creaked open again. Rosalie Carmichael stood there, her fine clothes whipped by the wind, her face a mask of desperate ambition. Is it done? She asked, looking at Silas, ignoring Royce and her sister completely. Is he dead? Violet gasped. Rosalie, what are you doing? Royce stared at her, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into its terrible place. You, he breathed. You were his informant. You told him when I was coming about the bride price." Rosalie's beautiful face twisted into a sneer. "Of course. Papa was too weak to save us, so I made my own deal. Silas gets his revenge, and I get a clear path away from this miserable life. It was a perfect plan." She looked at Royce with pure contempt. "Until you decided to play the noble fool and keep her. The betrayal was absolute, a poison that sickened the very air in the room." In that moment of shocked silence, Royce moved. He lunged not at Silas, but at the heavy oak table upending it. It crashed to the floor, providing a momentary barrier. Silas fired the bullet, burying itself in the thick wood. The fight began. It was a brutal, disorienting ballet of violence inside the claustrophobic confines of the storm-lashed house. The howling wind was a constant scream visibility, reduced to glimpses through the swirling dust that seeped through the walls. A lantern shattered, plunging one corner into darkness. Royce fought with the raw desperation of a man with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. He was no longer a stoic rancher. He was a primal force fueled by 3 years of repressed grief and a new terrifying love for the woman cowering behind the overturned table. He disarmed Silas, the gun skittering into the shadows. The fight became hand-to-hand, a gritty, merciless struggle of fists and fury. It was not a clean Hollywood duel. It was the frantic, ugly business of survival. As they crashed against a wall, Silas's hand closed around the locket at his neck. The chain snapped. It flew through the air, landing near the hearth. At the sight of it, something broke in Silas. His rage faltered, replaced by a raw, agonized grief. "It was all I had left of her," he choked out. In that instant of distraction, Royce landed a final, decisive blow. Silas crumpled to the floor, unconscious but alive. Royce stood over him, chest heaving, the urge for vengeance, a hot fire in his blood. He could end it. He could end the man who had stolen his past and tried to destroy his future. He looked at Violet, who was staring at him, her face streaked with dust and tears. He saw not fear, but trust. He lowered his fist. He would not become the monster Silas believed him to be. He would choose justice, not revenge. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. The setting sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden fingers of light into the damaged home. The air between Royce and Violet was clear for the first time. The sheriff, alerted by a ranch hand who had seen Silas's men ride in, arrived with a posse an hour later. They found a strange scene: Royce and Violet sitting at their battered table, tending to each other's cuts and bruises with quiet efficiency. Silas Kane was tied securely to a chair, a disgraced Rosalie was weeping in a corner, and 2 silver lockets lay side by side on the mantelpiece. Silas was taken away in irons, his face a mask of empty defeat. Rosalie, implicated in the conspiracy, was arrested as an accomplice. She didn't look at her sister as they led her out. Magnus Carmichael, the sheriff, later told them would lose his ranch. He was left with nothing but the ruin he had brought upon himself. After the law had gone, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. Royce and Violet stood on the porch, watching the last of the sunlight bleed from the sky. Their home was damaged, their lives upended, but they were standing together. Royce reached out his hand, gently touching the bruise on her cheek. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement of their shared ordeal and the start of their new partnership. They had survived the storm both outside and within. Months later, life at the ranch had found a new peaceful rhythm. The fields were plowed, the barn roof was repaired, and the log house was once again a home filled not with silence, but with the quiet hum of a shared life. One cool autumn afternoon, Royce stood on the hill behind the house before the two simple wooden crosses that marked the graves of Sarah and his son. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. He took the silver locket, Sarah's locket, from his pocket. He had held on to it for so long, a talisman of his grief. Now its weight felt different. It was the memory of a life that was not a chain binding him to it. With a quiet finality, he knelt and placed the locket on the earth at the base of Sarah's headstone. He was not abandoning her memory. He was making peace with it, letting go of the guilt that Silas's hatred had so cruelly mirrored. He turned and walked back toward the house. Violet was waiting for him on the porch, a small smile on her face. In the months since the storm, he had watched her transform. The timid, frightened woman was gone, replaced by a quiet, confident partner who met his gaze directly, whose laughter was a rare and precious sound. He expected her to say something about supper or the coming cold snap. Instead, she held out a worn, leather-bound book. It was his ranch ledger. The account with the grain supplier was off, she said, her voice clear and steady. He overcharged you by $10 last month. I wrote him a letter to correct it. Royce stared at the book, then at her. He saw the neat, careful script filling the pages. He had never seen her read or write more than her own name. You, he began, unable to form the question. I've been practicing, she said, a proud blush coloring her cheeks. At night with your books. It's just letters and numbers. It's not so hard once you understand the pattern. She had taught herself. In secret, she had armed herself with knowledge, transforming herself from a dependent into a true partner. It was not a grand declaration or a passionate embrace. It was something far more profound. It was a ledger, balanced and true. Royce looked at this incredible woman, his wife, the one he had married by accident and chosen on purpose. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. They stood there together, looking out at the vast horizon, ready to face whatever future they could build side by side.